Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. I'm using my best podcast voice to better align with the content I'm about to present. Earlier this week, I came across a tweet from the American Medical Association that set off a curiosity in me about what was going on. You can find a link to the Twitter thread in the description below, but I'll read it for you for reference. Thread. To start. The AMA feels JAMA's recent podcast on racism was wrong, false, and harmful. JAMA maintains editorial independence from AMA, but we want to be clear. The podcast and tweet promoting it run counter to current AMA values, policies, and actions. Here is what the AMA does believe. 1. Structural racism exists. 2. Racism, in all its forms, is a public health threat. 3. We must dismantle racism to dismantle racism across all of healthcare. While the AMA has a past that we must reconcile with, today's AMA leadership took a pledge this summer in which they affirmed the AMA's current anti-racist commitments, stating our principles clearly as a united AMA Board of Trustees. As a small step in reconciling our past, our CEO, James L. Madara, published a viewpoint acknowledging that decision made by AMA leaders of the past have contributed to a healthcare system plagued by inequities. We'd like to reaffirm the statements in JAMA's tweet and podcast questioning the existence of structural racism are in no way reflective of the AMA as an independent organization. We hope this reinforces the universal, ongoing need to interrogate and address racism at all levels. Well, apparently the need to interrogate the question of whether structural racism actually exists isn't something the AMA is concerned with, because apparently that's what the JAMA did in their recent podcast. Now, I have brought up the podcast in its full entirety, except for the opening, because the music at the beginning may be copyrighted. So I'm going to skip over the introductory materials. You can find a link to the full podcast in the description below. But this is what you need to know. The interview is conducted between Ed Livingston, the Deputy Editor for Clinical Reviews and Education at JAMA, and Dr. Mitch Katz, the President and CEO of New York City Health and Hospitals. Specifically, Mr. Livingston is asking the question, if racism is effectively illegal because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and subsequent legislation thereof, how can there be structural racism? So he's asking Dr. Katz about structural racism in healthcare, and does it actually exist? Let's find out.
Dr. Katz, can you start by defining what structural racism is for us?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Ed. I think actually acknowledging structural racism can be helpful to us.
Okay, well, at least we're acknowledging that it exists. Except I thought we're supposed to be skeptical. I don't know. Let's find out.
Because structural racism is not about whether someone is a racist or whether.
Oh, okay. So structural racism being a belief system that someone has to, enact because of a philosophy of theirs, doesn't matter if someone's actually racist. Okay.
There's some individual person loves other people of a different ethnicity or doesn't like it. It's not about people's personal opinions.
Okay, so racism, a belief system that elevates and or denigrates people on the basis of their skin color, is not about a belief system. Okay.
Structural racism refers to a system in which
a system, you say?
Policies or practices or how we look at people perpetuates racial inequality.
Okay, so policies or practices. Policies or practices that have been effectively outlawed since 1964. But it doesn't require an individual who's racist to actually enact these policies or practices. Okay.
So it gets people off the question of, what people talking about? I'm not racist. My neighbor is African American. He and I go golfing every weekend. We love each other. I'm not racist. This is not about racism.
Oh, structural racism is not about racism. Got it.
Of meaning someone's individual views. This is about how, as a society, we perpetuate inequality. And
how, as a society, we perpetuate inequality, but it's not about being racist. Okay.
And you raised the issue of your own background, and you were insightful enough to mention to me that your family changed its name. We are of a similar age. I remember, my own father making reservations in the name of Mr. K instead of Mr. Katz.
Just as reference, this is the latest podcast in a series from the Journal of the American Medical Association, so they may reference back to things they discussed previously that we won't hear about here. Just for your edification.
Because of his fear that if he made a reservation in the name of Mr. Katz, his name would never come up on the list. I remember him explaining that he didn't go to law school because the feeling was that at that time they wouldn't hire a Jewish lawyer.
Okay, so your father made decisions on the fear of other people's actions. And he may have been justified at the time that these occurred, but that was his decision, wasn't it?
So, I mean, the idea of bias, prejudice is not a new one. It has existed in our society. I worked for many years in San Francisco and was horrified to learn that the history of the creation of Chinese Hospital was that the public sector in San Francisco, which is now an incredibly progressive place, in the 1880s wouldn't see Chinese Americans.
So back in the deep, dark pages of our history, racism was more prevalent, accepted, and legal. You don't say. That's amazing. Has anything changed since the 1880s by any chance? Has our society evolved or progressed in any way, shape, or form? Have our laws changed to better outlaw these things? I suppose not. I guess we're still living in the 1880s, right?
And viewed them as a source of disease. So this is not a new phenomena, but what we're talking about are how does policy prevent people from rising? So
yes, we are talking about that. It would be nice if we had some sort of active example about how that works. An active example of a structural racist policy that somehow skirts around the civil rights legislation of 1964 and onward. Would you give us that example, Doctor? I'd be certainly happy to hear it.
a common example outside of the health, but that people can understand. In almost every big city, when you're building a truck route, it isn't through the middle class neighborhoods. The truck route always goes through the lower income neighborhoods.
Truck routes. Right.
And that truck route, those trucks spew their diesel fumes, and the surrounding population is more likely to be exposed to that pollution, more likely to develop asthma, more likely to then miss school because they developed asthma. In that poor section, because our society, despite the civil rights movement, in many cities remains segregated.
So you're talking about class, not race, unless you're assuming a quality of life based on race. But that would be you, wouldn't it?
And so in certain neighborhoods, the schools are not as good. The hospitals have fewer resources, so the children don't get educated in the same way. The hospitals are not able to provide the same level of care, not because they don't want to, not because the doctors aren't every bit, if not more committed to that population, since they're choosing to work in safety net hospitals.
So truck routes are the bane of all existence in our society. I had no idea. Tell me more, Doctor.
But because the resources are not there. So, I think what's important is that we ask ourselves, we know that there are disparities. We recognize that the racial disparities in the US are connected to income. So
the racial disparities in our country are connected to income. How?
So what are the set of interventions? What are the sets of changes in policy that we can do? Income grants. If you want people to be out of poverty, you can provide them economic assistance that enables them to not live at the level of poverty.
So poverty, class, is delineated by race. Huh. There are no poor white people? There are no wealthy black people? Interesting. Tell me more, doctor.
As you and I were talking, housing can be important not just for people who are homeless, but for people who are living in substandard housing. We can improve those conditions. To the extent you improve the conditions, then you're participating in a set of practices that decreases racial inequality. And
I don't think there's any argument that there is a distinct class disparity in this country. I think it's fairly obvious. But then to entwine race with that is a bit of a leap, I think, to inherently say that that's one and the same. So giving money to poor people, just as grants, is going to equalize racial disparities as well. Interesting theory, since racism is not class dependent. I'm not sure if our speaker knows that, but moving on.
instead of perpetuating it.
So the way you explain it, which is, by the way, is a wonderful explanation.
I would tend to disagree. That doesn't explain much of anything. Truck routes as racial segregationist policy sounds a bit abstract.
I think the term racism might be hurting us because
I know it pains me every day.
as I articulated, my response to it is just what you, and your explanation of my response is, I don't feel I'm a racist. I grew up in a family where racism was reviled, and my parents taught me never to hate based on what people's colors are or their religion, because they had suffered the most extreme violence because they were Jews. And they said, that's wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. You can't do that. So I grew up kind of anti-racist, that just never ever even think about a person's race or ethnicity when you're evaluating them.
I'm sorry, Mr. Livingston. Apparently, you don't understand the definition of anti-racism in the modern day. Anti-racism is the belief that racism is the universal constant. Everyone is racist. And there's only two states of being. Either you are simply a out-and-out racist, or you are anti-racist, in which you acknowledge your racism and proceed to try to push back against it, though you can never cure yourself of it because it's inherent. It is an original sin. So to say that you're not racist, actually, is not anti-racist. Whereas anti-racism is confession, saying you're not racist is denial.
Yet I feel like I'm being told I'm a racist in the modern era because of the...
Well, you are, Mr. Livingston. You are. If you are anti-racist, you are a racist. It's just that you're being honest about your inherent racism. So, yes. Plus, you're white. So whether you like it or not, you are.
This whole thing about structural racism. But what you're talking about isn't so much racism as much as that there are populations that it's more of a socioeconomic phenomenon that have a hard time getting out of their place because of their environment. And it isn't their race, it isn't their color, it's their socioeconomic status, it's where they are. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah.
Well, wouldn't that be structural classism? If it doesn't actually involve race, wouldn't it be structural classism? Which would make a heck of a lot more sense, wouldn't it?
Yes, so you are not a racist.
Oh, he's not a racist. Okay. Well, that's good to know. Dr. Katz has absolved Mr. Livingston of his inherent sin. That's a positive step forward. Of course, I don't know how you could have a negative step forward, but I'm just talking off the cuff here.
And also, we're not going to end structural racism by focusing on individual people's attitudes.
Oh, okay. So structural racism, racism again, which is a belief system and ideology perpetuated by, well, people, is not going to be solved by changing people's minds. Got it.
We're going to end structural racism by changing policies that keep people down. That's how we're going to do it.
Give me an example of a policy that keeps people down. Are we talking about truck routes? So if we need to change truck routes, we need to run truck routes through suburban areas. And in this way, we will even out the playing field of the consequences of truck routes so that everybody suffers because it's truck routes. Is that what I'm getting? Because in the example of truck routes, the only way to really solve that problem is to run truck routes through everyone's neighborhoods. So no one demographic gets the damage compared to another demographic. Or did I misunderstand the example?
I think where it goes beyond socioeconomic but still stays as a societal issue is that because of the country's past with slavery, because of views that people held toward the Chinese coming to San Francisco or
back in the 1880s, because of things that occurred back in the 1800s. Yes, doctor?
Mexicans coming to Los Angeles, there are biased views, and that the goal should be that society should not reinforce them.
Okay. And how do you propose we go about doing this, curing ourselves of the belief systems from the 1880s that are still prevalent today and so very popular that structural racism is just inherent?
One of my co-authors tells a really funny story. Dr. Lewis Hart, he's a pediatrician with us, brown-skinned African-American.
Brown-skinned African-American. That's an interesting way to describe someone. Is there any possibility you could leave out irrelevant aspects of their makeup and just talk about them as an individual? I know it's a novel idea.
He grew up in Canada until he was a young teenager. When he came to the US, the question that people asked him the most was, "What's your ethnicity?" And he answered Canadian, because he wasn't aware, that in the US, race was considered such a major part of your identity.
Well, wouldn't it be nice if race wasn't considered a part of identity? Wouldn't it be nice if race was considered as relevant to one's identity as hair color or eye color? Wouldn't it be nice? But I'm told over and over and over again that race is an identity. That racial identitarianism is the necessary aspect to considering people these days. I'm very confused.
And I do believe, and I think there's good data to suggest that whatever people's belief, they cannot necessarily prevent the idea that they may react differently to a person who looks different than they do.
I suppose that's possible depending on the circumstances, but what are you saying? That racism is natural and acceptable or understandable? I'm not quite sure.
That it happens. And again, JAMA has, done a good job, I think, of revealing ways that it happens between physicians. Again, I'll point out, not just along racial grounds. It can happen every time a woman doctor is assumed to be a nurse, or called honey, or told to get a doctor into the room.
We're talking about microaggressions and, passive sexism and things like that. All right, well, yes, those things exist. They have existed, they do exist, and they will continue to exist. Are those structural, or are those factors of personal behavior?
But there are ways that people see other people. And if you grow up African American and a number of people see you as dangerous or in some way less than, or less likely to succeed, maybe they wish you the best, but they feel, oh, you won't succeed because, they've never met an African American doctor, or they've never seen an African American as president until Obama, so they assume you can't be, that all of those things have an impact.
So we are to assume that any well wishes that are directed towards someone who's not white are actually just humoring them. That, in fact, any kind words that are spoken are just a cover over a demeaning and denigrating real assumption of thought. So, of whom should I assume this thinking? And what cues me into knowing what their true motives are? I'm just curious.
On that minority person. But the big thing that we can all do is move away from trying to interrogate each other's opinions and move to a place where we are looking at the policies of our institutions and making sure that they promote equality.
Can you give us an example of an institutional policy that is inherently racist, unequivocally, provably racist? Because if you can't do that, I have to assume you're projecting onto it something that may not actually be there. And so far, aside from truck routes, which you very specifically point to as a class issue, a socioeconomic issue, and not a race issue, that was your primary example. That was your go-to example of quote unquote structural racism, which it isn't. So, are you going to give us an example of a structurally racist policy that needs to be changed? You must know of at least one. Otherwise, you'd be completely talking out of your ass, wouldn't you?
So you're an editor at JAMA Internal Medicine. I'm a full-time editor at JAMA. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about words and what those words mean. I think using the term racism invokes feelings amongst people, as I just said my own feelings earlier on, that are negative, and that people do have this response that we've said repeatedly.
Yes, imagine being accused of being a racist. Would you take that negatively? I don't know why you would. In fact, the concept of racism, why would anybody think that of as being a negative ideology? And delineating and judging people on the factor of things they have no control over, and assume quality of thought or a quality of being or a quality of worth simply on the basis of skin color. Why would that be considered negative in any context? I can't possibly imagine.
I'm not a racist, so why are you calling me a racist? And that's because they respond that way. They're turned off by the whole structural racism phenomenon.
Yes, and indeed, denying one's racism is just more proof of your racism. We are, in a way, in the modern Salem. Do you deny that you are a witch? Denial is just more proof of your guilt. But we can't make that analogy, can we, Doctor?
Are there better terms we can use? Is there a better word than racism?
Yes, because here at JAMA, we focus on the meaning of words. So instead of talking about the words that are actually relevant to the conversation, let's just change the words. Let's find a nicer word for racism. I have a question. What in the absolute hell is going on here?
There may well be. I don't know it. Again, when I describe it, I always try to get people to focus on the structural part of it and to help people see that the issue is not trying to tell people how to think, which I think will always fail.
No, it's not about trying to tell people how to think, how to see things that are patently not involving race actually do involve race. How truck routes through neighborhoods is a racial issue and not a class issue. I'm not telling you how to think. I'm telling you how to interpret the reality around you based on my opinion. That's all.
And I think that one of the mistakes that good people make is thinking that we need to tell people how to think. That is not going to succeed. You cannot tell people how to think.
Well, you're doing a very lousy job at it right now, Doctor.
But you can create a society that promotes equality.
I'll just ask, how?
So asking you a hard question, what do we do to end structural racism or try to address it the best we can?
We acknowledge that it exists.
Yes, acknowledge that it exists. Even without proof, even without active evidence, just the belief alone is enough. Got it.
So, and again, that's why I make the distinction. Acknowledging structural racism does not mean saying that I'm a racist.
Doesn't it, though? Because if you're saying that structural racism exists and you operate within a structure, whether it be an institution or an organization or society in general, well, aren't you contributing to racism? Aren't you just a useful idiot in the movement of racism? How does this work, doctor? How does one separate oneself from the structure when the structure is made up of people like you?
It means saying that our country's policies need to be changed.
Which ones, doctor? Which ones are inherently racist, doctor? I'm willing to entertain the possibility that you have an active example that actually makes sense. But so far, truck routes are all put on the table. So, do you have something else?
And then I think your next part would be to say, okay, well, what would the US look like if we didn't have structural racism?
Well, doctor, I can imagine quite a bit in the absence of any evidence of anything. I can ask myself, what would the country look like if everyone had a flying car? I could ask myself, what would the country look like if dinosaurs still walked the earth? But that's all just imagination. It doesn't mean anything. It's frivolous. Do you have an actual real-world example of a policy that needs to be revised in order to reduce structural racism? You must know of at least one.
What it would look like is that we might still have people living in poverty, but they wouldn't be disproportionately minority.
Oh, so the poverty would be evenly spread about all racial demographics. Poverty wouldn't be solved, it would just look more diverse. Well, that is a comforting thought, doctor.
We would still have people in jail, but they wouldn't be disproportionately minority.
Ah, so our criminal justice system is inherently racist. All right, I will take that on. Doctor, tell me of a policy in national law or even just state law that is inherently racist. I'm open to the possibility that it exists, but you need to give me an example and then tell me how it can be revised to reduce structural racism. Will you do that? I have my doubts.
We would still have people who lived in substandard housing, but they wouldn't be disproportionately from the minority. We would, at every level, you would see all of the country in a equitable way.
So the current status of people in our country is not necessarily as a result of their own choices or the circumstances they find themselves in, but they're only there because of structural racism. Structural racism, which cannot be described to us in any specificity because we just need to acknowledge it exists, even in the absence of any actual evidence or examples. Got it.
So that the proportion of doctors and lawyers and senators and Supreme Court justices would reflect the percentages in the population because
So you want to have representation not based on population, but on demographic statistics. I see. So how many demographic statistical intricacies do we need to get down to, doctor? I mean, do we need to have a representative for Black people and then a representative for female Black people and then a representative for gay white men? Do we need to have a representative for stamp collectors? What exactly are you proposing?
we don't believe that it's genetic differences, right? We don't believe that the disproportionate harm that's come to African Americans and Latinos for their health is because of genetic differences. We're physicians and we know there are a few diseases, whether that's sickle cell or Tay-Sachs.
So it's not about genetic differences, but here are examples of diseases that are genetically based and then can be tied in some way, shape, or form to having a disproportionate effect on certain racial demographics versus others. But it's not genetic. So disparities in healthcare between these racial demographics, it's not genetic, it's structural. Structure where we don't have to talk about the individual, but the policies. So there is a policy somewhere, I guess, in the medical industry that says Black people and Hispanic people need to receive lesser quality care. All right, doctor, where is that policy? Name it. I am very curious to know what policy says this has to happen.
That have a genetic basis. But that is not why we believe that Black and brown people have higher mortality in this country due to COVID and a number of other illnesses.
So, what belief system do you use to reach this conclusion, doctor?
So, the world that doesn't have structural racism is a world where everyone doesn't grow up to be president, but anyone could grow up to be president.
We don't live in a world where anyone could grow up to be president. Got it.
Structural racism is an unfortunate term to describe a very real problem.
Is it a real problem? Because so far I haven't heard any actual examples, any policies put forward. If there's a structure to it, then you should be able to point to those particular, I-beams in the structure that hold it up. But so far I heard truck routes and nothing more. So if it is so obvious, if it is so prevalent, if it's so on its face clear that it can be changed and our world can be improved, you could give us actual examples, right?
There are structural problems in our society. As Dr. Katz pointed out,
there are structural problems in all societies. There are structural problems in the post office. There are structural problems in the building down the street. No system is perfect. There are flaws. But you need to be able to identify these flaws, not just say they exist and operate on a belief system. Otherwise, you're not going to solve anything, and you're not going to convince anyone there actually is a problem, unless it's all an article of faith.
Neighborhoods that are impoverished. The quality of life is poor in those areas because we may put factories in them or have major thoroughfares that travel through them.
Right. Truck routes. Truck routes for racism.
But we strive to have a society that's more equal, where everybody has the same opportunities, so that hardworking people can improve those neighborhoods and make them better for the people who live there. The racism part means that in those poor areas, there tends to be a disproportionate share of certain kinds of races, such as Blacks or Hispanics.
And why is that? What structures, what policies lead to those outcomes? I am open to hearing about them, but you need to put them forward, because I'm not that jazzed with operating on faith.
They aren't there because they're not allowed to buy houses in better neighborhoods.
All right. Tell me the law, tell me the policy that says that someone is not allowed to buy a house in a better neighborhood because of their skin color. Tell me where redlining is still active. I am open to the proposal that such things are still occurring. You need to be specific. I'm not going to take it on faith.
Or they can't get a job because they're Black or Hispanic. That would be illegal.
Yes, it would be illegal. And accordingly, the police sirens are in the background to underscore the idea of legality. But that being said, if it is illegal to structure the sale of houses or the distribution of employment on the basis of race, then where is the structure? If it's not about changing individual minds, if we're not talking about people here, but policies and systems and so on, if it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, where is the structure.
But disproportionality does exist, and we as a society need to figure out why that occurs and how to make conditions better for the people who live in structurally undesirable circumstances.
You claim to know why that occurs. Dr. Katz claims to know why that occurs. Structural racism. If you have already identified the problem, then you must already know the solution. But so far, you've said that structural racism exists, but you have offered no proof that it exists. If structural racism exists separate from individual human beings, if it is about on-paper policy and law, then you should be able to point to the on-paper policy and law that promotes structural racism. Truck routes do not sound to me like a definitive example.
Personally, I think taking racism out of the conversation would help. Many people like myself are offended by the implication that we are somehow racist, when many of us grew up in an era where there had been racism, and much progress had been made in ameliorating racism via dramatic legislation that was passed in the 1960s.
Oh, legislation. You mean structure?
I think the population at large would be more accepting of this general concept if we concentrated on the structural part of it and ensured that all people who lived in these disadvantaged circumstances have equal opportunities to become successful and have better qualities of life.
Where are they not being provided that? Tell me. Because oftentimes I'm not hearing about equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome. Equality versus equity. I'm not quite sure you know what you're talking about.
The focus must be on equal opportunity and making sure that that exists. Others at the JAMA Network have discussed this and related topics, and we've linked to those podcasts in the show notes.
Well, I'm going to call that there because that's effectively the end of the podcast. What makes me very curious is the American Medical Association's reaction to this podcast. Because you'd think from the AMA's reaction that this podcast questioned the existence of structural racism. Now, obviously, our host was asking our interviewee how to describe structural racism. But throughout the entire conversation, I didn't hear anything about structural racism not existing. So I have to wonder, did the American Medical Association, or at least the representatives that made their declarations, actually listen to the podcast? I don't think so. Now, there was a tweet associated with this podcast being presented that said something to the effect, and it's been since deleted, so I can only quote it from memory. No physicians are racist, so how does structural racism exist? Now, obviously, the statement, no physicians are racist, is probably too far afield for anyone to believe. To say that would be a gross generalization. So on that score, it was an awkwardly made tweet. But the podcast itself, it seems to shore up the belief that structural racism exists, without question, without evidence, without qualification. So, that is what I have for the show today. This has been my podcast voice. For those of you that wonder why I'm talking like this, I thought I'd give it a try. Maybe it's a little bit ASMR, but, occasionally a little change is exciting. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to put them, in the comments. And with that, I wish everybody a good Saturday. If you'd like to hear more from me or Satsu 2 Cents, you can find both of us tonight on my channel at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern for The Lords of the Night, where we will talk about the news of the day, news stories you submit, what we've been up to on the internet, and then your questions and comments. And tonight, a special guest, my sister, Sister Scribe. So I hope you've all had a good day. Thank you for joining me. Pinkala Driving 8-Man. Oh good, I am only 40 minutes late. Well, better late than never. I hope everyone is safe and well. If you're not well, please get well soon. And I'll see you on the next one. Take care, and bye-bye.